much. They were in the main room. I heard them dancing and laughing. Kaylee went upstairs and she screamed because someone was in the room. She ran downstairs. And I kept calling her name and she wouldn't answer. And then I saw the guy. I just locked the door and I ran downstairs. We don't know what's going on.
Just come here. There's two. Looks like fatalities.
I heard her scream and she ran downstairs because she saw someone. That's what I'm pretty sure she said. Someone's here, and she screamed and just ran downstairs. And I called for her name, but I jumped up and locked my door because I was so scared. And then I heard someone in the bathroom, and I heard her crying, and I heard some guy say that you're going to be okay, I'm going to help you. And I kept calling her name, but she wasn't answering. And then I opened the door for a second, and I saw this guy, and he was not insanely tall, but he was wearing all black and like this mask that was just covering his forehead and his mouth.
Well, get into town. We've got a quadruple homicide.
In the quiet college town of Moscow, Idaho, on a cold November night in 2022, a brutal nightmare unfolded at a house on King Road. For University of Idaho students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were viciously attacked and killed while they slept. The assailant used a large military-style knife, inflicting extensive wounds in a terrifyingly violent encounter. Inside the house, blood-smeared walls and floors told a story of sheer brutality and desperate resistance. Kaylee and Madison were found together in a blood-soaked bed, with Kaylee's face unrecognizable and Madison bearing defensive wounds. Xana lay face down in her room, covered in over 50 stab wounds, having fought fiercely for her life, while Ethan suffered fatal injuries nearby. The crime scene was a haunting tableau of terror and tragedy that forever changed a community, leaving questions that still resonate today. The final hours began like any other Saturday night in Moscow, Idaho. November 12, 2022, a night that should have been filled with laughter, late-night snacks, and the carefree spirit of college life. Instead, it became the prelude to unspeakable horror. Kaylee Gonzalez had driven down from her family home that weekend, excited to show off her new Range Rover to her best friend Madison Mogen. The two had been inseparable since 6th grade, and now, as seniors, they were savoring their final months of college freedom. Kaylee brought Murphy, her beloved golden doodle, along for what was supposed to be a fun weekend reunion. Meanwhile, Xana Kernodle was preparing for a night out with her boyfriend Ethan Chapin. The young couple had found something special together, that kind of love that makes everyone around them smile just watching their interactions. Ethan, a triplet who lived for adventure and brought joy wherever he went, had planned to spend the night at Xana's place after a fraternity party. But someone else was watching. Someone who had been circling this house like a predator stalking prey for months. 23 times, his phone had pinged near this location. 23 times, he had driven through these streets, studying, planning, fantasizing about what he would do when the moment was right. The evening unfolded innocently enough. Kaylee and Madison headed to the Corner Club, a local sports bar where college students gathered to blow off steam. They laughed, they drank, they lived in blissful ignorance of the eyes watching from the shadows. At 1:30 a.m., they left the bar and made their way to the Grub Truck, that beloved late-night food spot where students satisfied their post-party cravings. Security footage would later capture them giggling and chatting as they waited for their order, two best friends enjoying what would be their final moments of pure happiness. The killer was already moving. His white Hyundai Elantra had been spotted circling the neighborhood, making pass after pass like a shark sensing blood in the water. He knew their routines. He knew when they came home. He knew exactly how to get inside. At 1:56 a.m., Kaylee and Madison arrived home via rideshare, completely unaware that death was already closing in. The house on King Road should have been their sanctuary. Instead, it was about to become their tomb. Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, the two surviving roommates, were already inside. Xana and Ethan had returned from the fraternity party and were settling in for the night. Everything was normal. Everything was safe. Everything was about to shatter into a million pieces. At 4 a.m., Xana placed a DoorDash order. Such an ordinary act, a hungry college student ordering late-night food. The delivery driver would later describe seeing lights on throughout the house, music playing, a female figure moving around the third-floor bathroom window. Life was happening. Innocent, beautiful life. But the predator was already there, lurking in the darkness behind the house. He parked in the back lot, away from prying eyes, away from cameras that might capture his approach. He had studied this house for months. He knew about the sliding glass door that was often left unlocked. He knew the layout. He knew exactly where his victims would be sleeping. At approximately 4:13 a.m., Evil walked through that unlocked door. The attack was swift, brutal, and calculated. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was execution. The killer moved through the house with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times. He carried a military-style K-bar knife, a weapon designed not just to kill but to devastate. Madison and Kaylee were asleep in Madison's bed on the third floor, two best friends sharing space just like they had as children. The killer found them there, vulnerable and defenseless. Madison, sleeping on the outside of the bed, was likely his first victim. The attack was so sudden, so vicious, that she barely had time to process what was happening. But Kaylee, fierce, fighter Kaylee, she woke up. She tried to escape, but the bed was positioned against the wall, trapping her. She fought with everything she had, but it wasn't enough. The brutality was beyond comprehension. Kaylee suffered over 30 stab wounds. Her face was so disfigured that she was barely recognizable. The killer didn't just want to kill her, he wanted to destroy her. Some unknown weapon, possibly the knife handle or something else entirely, caused blunt force trauma that broke her nose and shattered her facial structure. Even seasoned investigators couldn't immediately comprehend what they were seeing. But the nightmare wasn't over. Somehow, in his frenzy or perhaps drawn by noise, the killer encountered Zana. She had come upstairs, possibly hearing the commotion, possibly just using the kitchen. Phone data shows she was on TikTok until 4:12 a.m. Such a normal, mundane detail that makes what happened next even more horrifying. Security cameras captured the sounds at 4:17 a.m., distorted audio of what sounded like voices, a whimper, then a loud thud that would haunt investigators forever. Zana saw something in that third-floor hallway. She turned away, perhaps not fully understanding what she was witnessing in the darkness. But the killer pursued her, following her down to her second-floor bedroom where Ethan lay sleeping. The attack on Zana was savage beyond description. Over 50 stab wounds, mostly defensive, telling the story of a young woman who fought for her life with desperate courage. Deep gashes on her hands showed how she tried to protect herself from the blade that kept coming, kept slashing, kept destroying. A wound between her pointer finger and thumb cut so deep it seemed to split her hand in half. Ethan never had a chance. The killer struck him while he slept, delivering a fatal blow under his left clavicle that severed multiple vital arteries. But even in death, the killer's rage wasn't satisfied. Deep cuts to the back of Ethan's legs suggested a level of overkill that spoke to something far beyond simple murder. This was the work of someone who took pleasure in causing pain. The most chilling detail? Throughout this massacre, Dylan Mortensen heard sounds that would replay in her nightmares forever. She heard what she thought was Kaylee playing with Murphy. She heard someone say, "There's someone here." She heard crying from Zana's room. And then she heard a male voice, cold and emotionless, saying, "It's okay. I'm going to help you." Words that still send chills down the spine of everyone who hears them. When Dylan finally opened her door, she came face to face with evil itself. A figure dressed in black, wearing a mask, with bushy eyebrows that would become crucial to identifying him later. They locked eyes for a moment that lasted an eternity. He was holding something near his waist, possibly the bloody knife, possibly a gun. He could have killed her too. He could have eliminated the only witness. But something made him turn away, walking past her toward the kitchen and out the sliding glass door he had entered through. Dylan stood frozen in terror as the killer disappeared into the night, leaving behind a scene so horrific that first responders would struggle to process what they were seeing. Blood everywhere, cast-off patterns on the walls and ceilings, arterial spray that painted the rooms in violence. For young lives snuffed out in minutes by a monster who had planned every detail except getting caught. the killer thought he was perfect. He thought he had committed the perfect crime. He had no idea he'd left behind the one piece of evidence that would eventually lead investigators straight to his door. A knife sheath with a microscopic amount of his DNA, dropped next to Madison's body in his haste to escape. For 8 agonizing hours, those who survived shared a house with the dead, never knowing that their friends lay slaughtered just feet away. When help finally arrived, when the truth was finally discovered, when the full scope of this nightmare was finally revealed, even hardened investigators found themselves struggling to understand how one human being could inflict such devastation on 4 innocent souls who had done nothing more than live their lives and follow their dreams. This wasn't just murder. This was the systematic destruction of everything good and pure in the world, carried out by a predator who had been hiding in plain sight, watching, waiting, and planning the perfect moment to unleash hell on earth. While 4 young lives were being celebrated in memorials across the country, investigators began piecing together the disturbing puzzle of who could commit such unspeakable acts. The answer would prove more chilling than anyone could have imagined, not because the killer was some obvious psychopath lurking in shadows, but because he had been hiding in plain sight, masquerading as someone dedicated to understanding the very crimes he would eventually commit. Brian Christopher Kohberger didn't emerge from the stereotypical background of neglect and abuse that often characterizes violent criminals. Born into a middle-class family in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania, he appeared, on the surface, to be just another awkward kid trying to find his place in the world. His parents were hardworking, his siblings seemed normal, and nothing in his early environment screamed, future mass murderer. But beneath that unremarkable exterior, something dark was already taking root. As a teenager, Brian was the kind of kid who seemed to exist on the periphery of everything. Not quite fitting in, not quite standing out, but always watching. Classmates from his hometown would later describe him as an outcast, someone who endured relentless bullying throughout his school years. While other kids were forming friendships and discovering themselves, Brian was learning to harbor resentment, to study human behavior from the outside looking in, to nurture grievances that would fester in the darkness of his mind. His online posts from those formative years painted a disturbing picture of a young man wrestling with what he described as emotional numbness. He wrote about feeling like an organic sack of meat with no self-worth, describing his existence as watching his life unfold like a video game he could control without feeling remorse. Even more unsettling was his struggle with visual snow, a neurological condition that created constant static in his vision, making him see the world through a perpetual haze that seemed to mirror his psychological state. During his late teens and early 20s, Brian's life took a dramatic downward spiral. He battled heroin addiction, that soul-crushing disease that strips away humanity piece by piece. But here's where his story takes an interesting turn. Unlike many addicts who remain trapped in cycles of destruction, Brian managed to claw his way out. He got clean, lost a significant amount of weight, and seemed to transform himself entirely. To those who knew him during this period, it looked like a redemption story, a young man who had overcome his demons and was ready to contribute something positive to society. But was he really reformed, or was he simply learning to hide his darkness more effectively? Brian's geographic journey reads like a roadmap to murder. From his troubled youth in Pennsylvania, he made his way to DeSales University, where he began pursuing graduate studies in criminal justice and psychology. Think about that for a moment. A man who would go on to commit one of the most brutal quadruple murders in recent memory was studying the very field dedicated to catching people like him. The irony is so twisted it's almost incomprehensible. It was during his time at DeSales that Brian's fascination with criminal behavior took on a more sinister edge. Fellow students would later report that he seemed obsessed with certain cases, particularly violent crimes involving young women. He conducted research surveys asking convicted criminals about their thought processes, their emotions during their crimes, their feelings of remorse or lack thereof. Was this academic curiosity, or was he conducting research for his future endeavors? In August 2022, just 3 months before the Idaho murders, Brian made a move that would prove fateful for everyone involved. He transferred to Washington State University in Pullman, pursuing his PhD in criminology while working as a teaching assistant. Pullman sits just 10 miles from Moscow, Idaho, close enough to easily scope out potential targets, far enough away to maintain the illusion of separation. To his new classmates and colleagues at WSU, Brian initially appeared to be just another graduate student grinding through his studies. He was described as gregarious by some, though others found him off-putting in ways they couldn't quite articulate. But as the semester progressed, faculty members began expressing concerns about his behavior, particularly his interactions with female students. The contrast between Brian's public persona and his private reality was stark and terrifying. Publicly, he was a scholar of criminal justice, someone supposedly dedicated to understanding crime in order to prevent it. He participated in class discussions about criminal behavior, wrote papers on the psychology of offenders, and presented himself as someone genuinely interested in making the world safer. Privately, he was conducting surveillance missions that would make a professional stalker envious. Brian's living situation provided the perfect cover for his increasingly disturbing activities. His graduate housing apartment in Pullman gave him a respectable address and academic credentials that deflected suspicion. He had the financial means to maintain his white Hyundai Elantra and the freedom that comes with being a graduate student, flexible schedules, minimal oversight, and the ability to come and go as he pleased without raising eyebrows. His social circles were limited but strategically chosen. He gravitated toward academic environments where his interest in criminal psychology could be discussed openly without seeming suspicious. He engaged with professors and fellow students about violent crime, asking probing questions about methodology, victim selection, and crime scene analysis. To them, he was simply a dedicated student. In reality, he was gathering intelligence for his own dark purposes. The warning signs were there, subtle but present for those who knew how to look. Female students in his classes began complaining about his behavior, the way he would stare, his dismissive and sometimes hostile attitude toward women, his tendency to make inappropriate comments. Faculty members noted his fixation on certain types of crimes and his unsettling questions about victim psychology. But perhaps the most chilling warning sign was his online activity. Brian spent time researching cases involving home invasions, knife attacks, and crimes targeting young women. He studied the Elliot Rodger case with particular intensity, the self-proclaimed incel, who killed 6 people in a shooting and stabbing rampage near UC Santa Barbara. Rodger had expressed a specific desire to enter a sorority house and kill every woman inside, a fantasy he was unable to fulfill during his actual attack. Brian's cell phone data revealed a pattern of behavior that, in hindsight, reads like a masterclass in criminal stalking. Starting in July 2022, his phone began pinging near the victim's residence on King Road. 23 separate occasions between July and November, always during the late night or early morning hours when potential victims would be most vulnerable. Each visit was a reconnaissance mission, each drive-by an opportunity to study patterns, routines, and vulnerabilities. The most disturbing aspect of Brian's background isn't what he did. It's how successfully he hid what he was planning to do. He maintained his academic standing, kept up appearances with family and friends, and continued his research into criminal behavior while simultaneously planning to become the very type of criminal he was studying. The level of compartmentalization required for such deception suggests a mind capable of profound manipulation and control. When Brian drove across the country with his father for Christmas break in December 2022, just weeks after committing a quadruple murder, he appeared to be just another graduate student heading home for the holidays. His father saw nothing unusual in his behavior, noticed no signs of the monster his son had become. Even when they were pulled over twice for traffic violations during their journey, stops that were likely part of FBI surveillance, Brian maintained his composure, acting like any ordinary citizen dealing with routine police encounters. The most terrifying realization about Brian Kohberger is that he represents a new breed of criminal, highly educated, socially functional on the surface, and sophisticated enough to nearly get away with mass murder. He didn't fit the profile of a disorganized killer acting on impulse. Instead, he demonstrated the methodical planning and execution capabilities of someone who had studied exactly how to commit the perfect crime. Unfortunately for his victims, he had almost succeeded. What makes the Idaho student murders so bone-chillingly terrifying isn't just the brutality of the acts themselves. It's the methodical precision with which they were carried out. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random act of violence. This was the culmination of months of meticulous planning, surveillance, and psychological preparation by someone who had turned murder into a science project. The The first known incident that would eventually lead to the King Road massacre didn't happen in November 2022. It began the moment Bryan Kohberger set foot in Pullman, Washington, in August 2022. Within days of his arrival, his phone started pinging near the victim's neighborhood, not randomly, but with the systematic regularity of someone conducting surveillance operations. But to understand how this monster operated, we need to look even further back, to March 2022, when Bryan was still living in Pennsylvania. That's when he made a purchase that would prove crucial to his future crimes. A K-bar military-style knife, complete with a tactical sheath. This wasn't an impulse buy or a collector's item. This was a weapon specifically chosen for its ability to inflict maximum damage with surgical precision. Think about the psychological implications of that timeline. In March, while still 3,000 miles away from his eventual victims, Bryan was already planning murder. He spent months carrying that knife, familiarizing himself with its weight, its balance, its lethal potential. By the time he arrived in Washington, he was already mentally prepared to kill. His victim selection criteria revealed a mind that had studied predatory behavior with academic thoroughness. Bryan didn't choose his targets randomly. He selected them with the cold calculation of someone who understood exactly what he was looking for. Young, attractive college women living in an environment that offered both access and vulnerability. The King Road house was perfect. A party house with multiple residents, frequent visitors, and security habits that were lax enough to provide opportunities for someone patient enough to wait for the right moment. The victims fit a specific demographic profile that seemed to appeal to Bryan's particular pathology. They were successful, popular, seemingly happy young women living the kind of college experience that someone like Bryan, awkward, isolated, resentful, might view with a mixture of envy and rage. They represented everything he felt denied in his own social experience, making them perfect targets for someone whose psychological drivers included deep-seated resentment toward those who seemed to have it all. The most disturbing aspect of Bryan's crime pattern development is how it reveals the vulnerabilities in our assumptions about safety and security. He proved that with enough patience, planning, and psychological sophistication, even the most horrific crimes can be carried out by someone who appears completely normal on the surface. His ability to compartmentalize his academic life from his criminal planning, his skill at maintaining normal relationships while conducting surveillance operations, and his success at avoiding detection for months before the murders all point to a level of criminal sophistication that challenges our understanding of how monsters operate in modern society. The Idaho murders weren't an aberration or a moment of lost control. They were the inevitable culmination of a methodical process that had been years in the making, executed by someone who had turned the study of criminal behavior into a blueprint for committing the perfect crime. Unfortunately for 4 innocent victims, his methodology was nearly flawless. The investigation into the Idaho student murders would become one of the most complex and intense manhunts in modern American law enforcement history. What began as a horrifying crime scene discovery on a Sunday morning would evolve into a multi-agency operation involving hundreds of investigators, cutting-edge forensic technology, and a level of public scrutiny that turned every piece of evidence into front-page news. When Moscow police officers first arrived at 1122 King Road on November 13, 2022, they encountered a scene that would haunt even the most experienced investigators. The evidence catalog they began compiling that day would eventually fill hundreds of pages and include some of the most crucial forensic discoveries in recent criminal history. The physical evidence painted a picture of calculated brutality that defied comprehension. Blood spatter patterns covered walls and ceilings throughout multiple rooms, with arterial spray patterns indicating the savage nature of the attacks. Cast-off blood evidence showed the killer's movements through the house, creating a macabre roadmap of his deadly progression from room to room. But it was a small, seemingly insignificant piece of evidence that would ultimately crack the case wide open. Next to Madison Mogen's body, investigators discovered a tan leather knife sheath, the kind used to protect a military-style K-bar blade. The killer had been so methodical in his planning, so careful in his execution, yet in his haste to escape, he had made the one mistake that would lead authorities straight to his door. The sheath contained a microscopic amount of DNA, not visible to the naked eye, but detectable through advanced forensic testing. That tiny genetic signature would prove to be the thread that, when pulled, would unravel Bryan Kohberger's entire web of deception. Digital evidence collection revealed the scope of the killer's surveillance operations. Cell tower data showed that starting in July 2022, a phone registered to Brian Kohberger had pinged near the King Road residence 23 separate times, always during late night or early morning hours when potential victims would be most vulnerable. This wasn't random movement, this was systematic reconnaissance. The most damning digital evidence came from the morning of the murders themselves. Brian's phone had disconnected from the cellular network near Pullman at 2:47 a.m., remaining dark during the time frame when the murders occurred. The phone reconnected at 4:48 a.m. near Blaine, Idaho, about 20 miles south of Moscow, as if someone had powered it back on after completing a task they didn't want tracked. Even more chilling was what investigators discovered about Brian's activities immediately after the murders. At approximately 9 a.m., just hours after committing a quadruple homicide, his phone showed him taking a selfie in his bathroom, a thumbs-up pose that suggested either complete disconnect from reality or chilling satisfaction with his night's work. Vehicle identification became another crucial component of the investigation. Surveillance cameras throughout the area had captured footage of a white sedan making multiple passes through the neighborhood in the early morning hours of November 13th. The car appeared around 3:30 a.m., circulating through the area with the persistence of someone searching for the perfect opportunity. At 4:04 a.m., the vehicle pulled up behind the King Road house and remained there for approximately 16 minutes, the exact time frame during which the murders occurred. At 4:20 a.m., cameras captured the same vehicle speeding away from the scene, nearly losing control while taking a corner in what appeared to be a desperate escape. Investigators painstakingly reviewed over 22,000 vehicle registration records to identify white Hyundai Elantras in the region. When they narrowed their search to vehicles registered in Pennsylvania, a state that doesn't require front license plates, matching the suspect vehicle, Brian Kohberger's name emerged as a person of interest. The timeline reconstruction process revealed the methodical nature of Brian's planning and execution. Starting with his arrival in Washington in August 2022, investigators traced his movements through cell phone data, surveillance footage, and witness accounts. The pattern that emerged was terrifying in its consistency: regular reconnaissance visits to the target area, each one building his knowledge of victim routines and security vulnerabilities. The night of the murders showed military-level precision in timing and execution. Brian left his apartment in Pullman around 2:50 a.m., with his phone going dark just before he began his approach to the King Road house. He struck during the narrow window between 4 a.m., when Zana's DoorDash order was delivered, and 4:20 a.m., when Dylan Mortensen encountered him leaving the scene. Forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed details that painted a picture of unprecedented brutality. The victims had suffered a combined total of over 100 stab wounds, with Kaylee receiving the most savage treatment. Her injuries were so severe that her face was rendered unrecognizable. Zana showed over 50 defensive wounds, telling the story of a young woman who fought desperately for her life. The medical examiner's findings confirmed that the weapon used was consistent with a K-bar military knife, the same type of blade that would have fit the sheath found at the scene. The wounds showed characteristics that matched both the tip and guard of such a weapon, providing crucial evidence linking the crime scene discovery to the murder weapon. Witness interviews revealed a community that had been living under threat without fully realizing it. Multiple residents reported seeing suspicious activity in the weeks leading up to the murders. A neighbor walking his dog between 9 o'clock and 11 a.m. on the morning of November 13th observed the front door of the King Road house standing wide open, unusual enough that he remembered it clearly and reported it to police. Perhaps the most crucial witness was Dylan Mortensen herself, whose testimony provided the only eyewitness account of the killer. Her description of a male figure approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, athletically built, wearing all black with a mask covering his mouth and nose, and having bushy eyebrows, would prove essential in identifying Brian Kohberger when he was eventually located. The DoorDash driver who delivered food to the house at 4 a.m. became an unexpected key witness. Her detailed account of seeing lights on throughout the house, observing a female figure in the third-floor bathroom window, and spending approximately 15 minutes in the area provided crucial timeline confirmation. The arrest of Brian Christopher Kohberger on December 30th, 2022, marked the end of a 47-day nightmare that had gripped not just Moscow, Idaho, but the entire nation. When Pennsylvania State Police surrounded the Koberger family home in the Pocono Mountains, they found their suspect calmly packing trash into Ziploc bags while wearing surgical gloves, behavior that spoke to either obsessive-compulsive tendencies or a guilty conscience attempting to eliminate evidence. The initial charges were as severe as the crimes themselves: 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. The prosecution wasted no time in announcing its intention to seek the death penalty, a decision that would add years of complexity to what was already shaping up to be one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in recent memory. Brian's defense strategy initially centered on a complete denial of involvement, despite the mounting evidence against him. His attorneys argued that their client was simply a night owl who enjoyed driving around the countryside, an explanation that might have seemed plausible if not for the 23 documented occasions his phone had pinged near the victim's residence, always during the predatory hours when most people were safely asleep. The defense team faced an almost impossible task: explaining away DNA evidence, cell phone data, surveillance footage, and eyewitness testimony that all pointed to their client's guilt. Their strategy evolved from outright denial to claims of rushed investigation and circumstantial evidence. But the prosecution's case was building into an avalanche of scientific proof that would prove virtually insurmountable. During his arraignment on May 22, 2023, Brian employed an unusual legal tactic called standing silent, refusing to enter a plea and forcing the judge to enter not guilty pleas on his behalf. This maneuver, rarely used in Idaho courts, suggested either a sophisticated legal strategy or a defendant so detached from reality that he couldn't acknowledge the charges against him. The trial's complexity was compounded by intense media attention and the defendant's academic background in criminology. Brian's understanding of legal procedures and forensic science enabled him to actively participate in his own defense in ways that most defendants cannot. His knowledge of criminal investigation techniques also raised questions about whether he had deliberately attempted to manipulate evidence or crime scene details to confuse investigators. Appeals and pre-trial motions stretched the legal proceedings across multiple years, creating additional trauma for the victims' families who desperately wanted closure. Brian's defense team filed numerous challenges to the evidence, the investigative methods, and even the court's jurisdiction. Each motion represented another delay, another postponement of justice for families already shattered by unimaginable loss. The death penalty aspect of the case added layers of complexity that transformed what might have been a straightforward murder trial into a years-long legal odyssey. Capital punishment proceedings require exhaustive examination of every piece of evidence, extensive jury selection processes, and automatic appeals that can stretch for decades. For families seeking swift justice, the legal system's deliberate pace became another form of torture. However, in a stunning turn that shocked legal observers and divided the victims' families, Brian Koberger ultimately accepted a plea deal on July 2, 2025. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to all charges and accepted 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for the burglary conviction. The plea hearing itself was a study in cold calculation. When asked directly by the judge if he had killed Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonzalez, Zana Kernadel, and Ethan Chapin, Brian answered with simple, emotionless yes responses that provided no explanation, no remorse, and no closure for the families desperate to understand why their children had to die. The final irony was that Brian, who had spent years studying criminal justice and believed he could commit the perfect crime, ultimately found himself subject to the very system he thought he understood. His academic knowledge couldn't overcome the relentless pursuit of investigators determined to bring him to justice, and his calculated plea deal became his final admission that even the most carefully planned crimes leave traces that skilled law enforcement can follow back to their source. In the end, justice was served not through the dramatic courtroom confrontation that many expected, but through the quiet acknowledgement of guilt from a man who had tried to play God with innocent lives and lost.
What's the location of your emergency?
Hey, Rose.
What's the location of your emergency?
We're on I-80 headed towards Holbrook.
I have you on the 180 about milepost 313.
Yeah.
Okay,
Is your emergency on the highway?
It's my daughter. She's with us. We live out in the desert, and we're hauling ass to Holbrook to the EMS station.
You're trying to get her to the EMS?
Yes.
Okay, how old is your daughter?
10.
She's 10, and what's going on with her?
She ran away for the third time in a week in the desert, and when the neighbor found her in the wash, she was unresponsive completely. And by the time she got back to the house, she was barely breathing, so I'm breathing for her now. She's unresponsive, unconscious, and unable to breathe for herself.
Okay, so she's still unconscious, unresponsive?
Yes.
Is she breathing?
I'm breathing for her.
What do you mean?
I am putting my mouth around hers and breathing in her lungs.
Her breath?
Yes.
What kind of vehicle are you driving, ma'am?
This is a Ford Focus. Gray. 2-door.
Okay, have you administered any CPR or just the rescue breaths?
Just rescue breath.
Okay, 1 second for me while I get EMS paged out to you. I need you to pull over so that I can page him out to you and we can start CPR.
Would it be easier if is it going to be faster if we just keep going? Because we're almost to Holbrook.
I understand that. I need you to pull over so I can have EMS meet you. Have you got her to the flat ground, solid ground?
Yeah, she's in the car.
Okay, I need you to put her on the ground.
On the rocks?
I need her on a flat ground so that you can administer CPR. Do you know how to administer CPR?
Yes, I do, unfortunately.
How long has it been since she's been responsive? We don't know. She ran away and they found her in the dirt. We only know for as long as he got her on the quad and gave her to us. I'm not getting any signs.
Where were you guys at?
We live
east of Petrified Forest, and we're like 20 minutes in.
So you're in Apache County?
Yeah, boys. We just moved here at the start of the month, so I'm still kind of getting
She was involved in an accident?
No, she ran away. She's on medications. And she hasn't been on these medications in about a month because we've been moving.
Okay.
And then she ran.
Hold on a second.
On July 27, 2025, authorities stumbled upon a horrifying scene at the intersection of two highways near Holbrook, Arizona. 10-year-old Rebecca was found on the roadside, unresponsive, dehydrated, and bearing the unmistakable signs of brutal abuse. She was rushed to Phoenix Children's Hospital, where her condition only grew more dire in the days that followed. When investigators traced her living situation, the picture grew even darker. Hidden away in a yurt described as the family's home, they found thin mattresses scattered on the floor, water hauled in plastic jugs from a store 15 miles away, and bloodied clothing that hinted at unthinkable suffering. Rebecca's body told the rest of the story, covered in bruises, burns consistent with cigarettes, missing toenails, patches of hair loss, and even evidence of a brain hemorrhage. What began on a lonely highway quickly spiraled into one of the most disturbing child abuse and first-degree murder cases Arizona has ever seen, with her father, Richard Baptiste, and his girlfriend, Anisha Woods, at the center of it all. Rebecca Baptiste came into this world on December 20th, 2014. She was a special little girl who brought light wherever she went. Rebecca had a deep love for the color pink, and she could spend hours playing with colorful balloons. More than anything, she enjoyed being with her two younger brothers. Her grandmother always said Rebecca was like a hero, someone who could make others smile even when times were hard. When Rebecca was in 4th grade, she attended a school called Empower College Prep in Phoenix, Arizona. She was the oldest of 3 children with brothers who were 8 and 6 years old. Rebecca was a good student who worked hard and always tried her best. In every photograph, you could see her bright smile and hopeful eyes. She believed in making the world a better place. But Rebecca's life had not always been easy. She and her brothers had lived in foster care for several years before coming back to live with their father, Richard Baptiste, in 2022. Richard was 32 years old, and he had fought to get his children back from the state. However, the reunion that should have been joyful became something much darker. On July 27, 2025, a Sunday that would change everything, Rebecca was discovered lying unconscious at a road crossing. She was found in what people call a wash, a dried-up riverbed where water used to flow. When the emergency workers found her, Rebecca was badly hurt, extremely thirsty, and looked like she hadn't eaten properly in a long time. The medical team rushed Rebecca to Little Colorado Medical Center as fast as they could. When the doctors saw how serious her injuries were, they quickly moved her to Phoenix Children's Hospital, where specialists could give her better care. For 3 days, Rebecca fought for her life while machines helped her breathe. Sadly, on July 30th, 2025, little Rebecca passed away. What the doctors found when they examined Rebecca shocked everyone who saw her medical reports. The injuries on her small body told a terrible story that was very different from what her father, Richard, and his girlfriend, Anisha, had claimed happened. Rebecca had suffered a serious brain injury that caused bleeding inside her head. Her spine was also fractured. Large chunks of her hair were missing, and several of her toenails had been torn off. Rebecca's body was covered in burn marks from head to toe. She had bruises and cuts everywhere, including 2 black eyes that made her face almost unrecognizable. The doctors, who had seen many injured children in their careers, said Rebecca's condition looked like someone had tortured her for a long time. They also found signs that suggested she may have been hurt in other terrible ways that no child should ever experience. The medical team had to tell Rebecca's family that her brain had stopped working because of all the bleeding and swelling inside her head. They connected her to machines that helped her body keep functioning, but there was no brain activity left. 3 days after she was found, Rebecca's young life came to an end. The community was heartbroken when they learned about Rebecca's death. People who knew her organized a memorial service where everyone wore pink clothes to honor her favorite color. They wanted to celebrate the bright, loving child she had been despite all the pain she had suffered. During this sad time, a local news reporter shared something beautiful that Rebecca had created. It was a poem she had written about her favorite color, and she had even drawn pictures to go with it. In her poem, Rebecca wrote about finding the color magenta in lovely flowers and plants with pink leaves. She wrote about chewing bubble gum and looking at her pink backpack. She mentioned going to farms to see pigs and watching the road for Barbie cars. The poem showed how Rebecca could find beauty and joy in simple things, even when her life was so difficult. At the bottom of her poem, Rebecca had written information about herself. She explained that she was in 3rd grade at Empower College Prep. She wrote about loving her teacher and enjoying math class, especially learning about fractions. Rebecca also mentioned that she liked to read books from a series called I Survived, which were adventure stories about people who overcame dangerous situations. In another part of her writing, Rebecca shared her feelings about endangered animals. She wrote that learning about animals in danger made her feel sad because she believed all animals should be loved and protected. She hoped that endangered animals would survive and be safe. These words showed what a caring and thoughtful child Rebecca was. What made Rebecca's poem even more heartbreaking was knowing that while she was writing these hopeful words about finding beauty in the world, her school principal and teachers were making worried phone calls to the Department of Child Safety. They had noticed marks on Rebecca's body that looked like someone had hurt her. They were concerned that she wasn't getting enough food and that someone was neglecting her basic needs. Just a few weeks before Rebecca was found injured, her family had moved from their home in Phoenix to a very remote area in Apache County. They were living in what's called a yurt, which is like a large tent that people can live in. Some reports said they had only been living in this isolated place for about 3 weeks when the terrible events happened. The police who investigated the scene found that the living conditions were very poor. The family didn't have proper bathrooms or showers. They had to use a bucket and cup to wash themselves. When officers searched the tent where Richard and Anisha lived, they discovered bloody clothing. This clothing had been taken off Rebecca before the emergency call was made, which raised many questions about what had really happened. The Department of Child Safety, which was supposed to protect Rebecca and her brothers, admitted they had lost track of the family when they moved to the remote area. Because the family had moved without telling anyone their new address, no one was checking to make sure the children were safe and being treated properly. Richard Baptiste and his girlfriend, Anisha Woods, told the police that Rebecca had been having behavior problems. They claimed she had tried to run away from home many times, both from their new place in Concho and from their previous home in Phoenix. Anisha told investigators that Rebecca would climb up into trees and hide, waiting for adults to walk by. When she saw grown-ups, Rebecca would come down and ask if she could live with them instead of going back home. Neighbors in both places had seen Rebecca trying to escape multiple times. Each time she was found, Rebecca was extremely thirsty and looked like she hadn't had water for a long time. People who lived nearby said Rebecca would climb trees to get a better view of the area. She was looking for houses where kind people might live, people who might take her in and give her a safe place to stay. The most heartbreaking part of Rebecca's story was learning about her mother. Rebecca's biological mother had lost the right to care for her daughter a long time ago. This meant Rebecca had been hoping for years that someone, anyone, would provide the love and safety that every child deserves, but that she had never truly found. When police officers interviewed Anisha about Rebecca's attempts to escape, she gave explanations that seemed to miss the real reasons why a child would desperately try to run away. According to a police document, Anisha told investigators that Rebecca would hide in trees, carefully watching for adults to pass by. Rebecca knew that people would eventually come looking for her, and she was trying to choose which grown-up she would approach to ask the most important question of her young life. "Can I live with you?" When detectives asked Anisha why she thought Rebecca wanted to find other adults to live with, her answer showed how little she understood about the child's suffering. Anisha claimed that Rebecca hated their property because it didn't have air conditioning and there wasn't a refrigerator. She said they mostly ate canned and boxed foods like chips, sandwiches, and granola bars, suggesting that Rebecca ran away because she wanted better food and a more comfortable home. But this explanation ignored the real truth. Rebecca wasn't running away because she wanted fancy food or air conditioning. She was desperately trying to escape from people who were hurting her in ways that no child should ever experience. Rebecca and her brothers had lived in foster care for 3 to 4 years before Richard regained custody of them in 2022. The court process happened in Maricopa County Superior Court, where a judge decided that Richard should be allowed to take his children back. This decision would prove to be tragically wrong, but at the time, the legal system believed Richard deserved another chance to be a father. Many people wondered why Richard had fought so hard to get his children back, only to treat them so badly. Some suspected that there might have been financial benefits to having the children, such as government assistance or welfare payments. It seemed strange that someone would go through a long legal battle to regain custody of their children and then cause them such terrible harm. When police found Rebecca that July day, Richard and Anisha told a story that medical experts quickly proved was false. They claimed that Rebecca had run away from home and had been found by neighbors in the wash. They suggested that her severe injuries came from falling while she was trying to escape. However, doctors who examined Rebecca said this story was impossible. Rebecca's condition was so serious that she couldn't have physically run anywhere. She was barely able to move her body at all. The medical evidence showed that someone had hurt her so badly that running away would have been beyond her physical capabilities. During police interviews, both Richard and Anisha made shocking admissions about how they had treated Rebecca. When detectives asked them directly about using force against the child, both adults admitted they had used excessive force. Richard told police this information without showing any emotion, as if he were discussing something as ordinary as the weather. Richard admitted that he had used a belt to punish Rebecca, claiming it was because she kept trying to run away. However, he denied being responsible for the head injuries that ultimately killed her. Anisha also admitted to hitting Rebecca with a belt and causing some of her bruises, but she tried to shift most of the blame onto Richard, saying he was the one who usually disciplined the children. What made Anisha's involvement even more disturbing was her background as a former nurse. Her job had been to help people heal and feel better, but instead, she was participating in hurting a defenseless child. It appeared that most of the abuse was focused on Rebecca, who was the only girl in the house. While her brothers were also mistreated, Rebecca seemed to receive the worst treatment. Despite her medical training, Anisha made a decision that showed how little she cared about Rebecca's well-being. Even though Rebecca was found dehydrated every time she tried to run away, Anisha would look at the injured child and decide she'd be fine without getting her proper medical care. When police showed Richard and Anisha photographs of Rebecca's injuries, their reactions revealed their lack of caring. Both adults showed very little emotion when confronted with pictures of what they had done to a child. Richard's response when he saw the extent of Rebecca's injuries was to say, "It wasn't supposed to do that." This comment raised the question. If it wasn't supposed to cause such damage, what exactly was it supposed to do? The evidence against Richard and Anisha continued to build when police searched their tent. They found bloody clothing that the couple had taken off Rebecca before calling for emergency help. This discovery raised serious questions about what had really happened and whether they had tried to hide evidence of their crimes. On July 29, 2025, both Richard Daniel Baptiste and Anisha Woods were arrested and charged with multiple serious crimes. They faced charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and 3 counts of child abuse. The child abuse charges were related not only to Rebecca but also to her 2 brothers, showing that all 3 children had suffered at the hands of these adults. The charges against them started as attempted first-degree murder, aggravated assault, child abuse, and kidnapping. However, after Rebecca died 3 days later, the charges were upgraded to include murder. During his interview with police, Richard admitted that he didn't deserve to be a father. Perhaps the most honest thing he said during the entire investigation. Both Richard and Anisha were held in jail with bail set at $1 million each. The prosecutors decided to try both cases together, arguing that Richard and Anisha had worked together in a planned scheme to abuse the children. Their preliminary hearing was scheduled for September 4, 2025. After Rebecca's death, her 2 brothers were placed in the custody of the Arizona Department of Child Safety. Given how badly the system had failed Rebecca, many people worried about whether her brothers would finally be safe. According to court documents and statements from Rebecca's uncle, Damon Hawkins, the boys were moved to a temporary home where they could begin to heal from the trauma they had experienced. When detectives interviewed Richard about Rebecca, they noticed that he showed very little concern for her well-being. Instead of acting like a worried father, Richard spent time complaining about Rebecca's behavior and explaining why she was difficult to parent. He described her as smart and helpful but also called her stubborn and said she always wanted to run away. Richard's comments about the challenges of parenting her compared to her brothers raised red flags for investigators. When a parent singles out one child as being more difficult than others, especially when that child keeps trying to escape, it often suggests that child is being treated differently, and often much worse. Richard tried to blame Anisha for what happened to the children, claiming that she was the one watching them while he was at work. He said they usually stayed inside during the hottest parts of the day, but neighbors contradicted this story. People who lived nearby had seen the children being forced to run outside and do hard work in the heat with very little water to drink. When detectives asked Richard about previous allegations of sexual abuse, he dismissed them as false claims that had been made when Rebecca was in foster care. Richard seemed to have an excuse for everything and always blamed someone else, whether it was Anisha, Rebecca herself, or the foster care system. However, doctors who examined Rebecca found evidence that supported these earlier concerns. They discovered injuries on her body that were consistent with sexual abuse. Rebecca had severe bruising throughout her body, what appeared to be cigarette burns on her back, and large chunks of her hair were missing. The doctors also found bruising in private areas of her body, which supported their conclusion that she had been sexually abused. Richard admitted to police that he drank alcohol and smoked marijuana, though he claimed he kept these substances locked away when he wasn't using them. When investigators asked him why he thought Rebecca kept trying to run away, his explanations continued to raise concerns. He suggested that maybe she wanted to see a neighbor or find a community well where she could get water. These comments showed that Richard understood Rebecca was desperately seeking help and water from other people, yet he didn't seem to understand that she was trying to escape from him. Rebecca was often found severely dehydrated after her escape attempts, and investigators learned that she had trouble drinking water on her own. Sometimes people had to pour water directly into her mouth because she couldn't physically manage to drink by herself. Anisha, despite her nursing background, used Rebecca's ability to swallow water when it was poured into her mouth as evidence that the child was fine. This decision showed either a shocking lack of medical judgment or a deliberate choice to ignore a child's suffering. The fact that Rebecca couldn't drink water on her own should have been a major warning sign that something was terribly wrong. Rebecca's brothers, when they were interviewed by police, confirmed what many people suspected. When asked about their sister, one of them said simply, "She got hit. She always got hit a lot." These words from a child's mouth told the true story of what Rebecca's daily life had been like in the home where she should have been safe and loved. The relationship between Richard and Anisha had begun about 4 years earlier when they both worked at a call center in Phoenix. It seemed like an ordinary workplace romance at first, but their partnership would eventually lead to terrible consequences for 3 innocent children. When detectives questioned Anisha about Rebecca's injuries, she tried to distance herself from responsibility. She claimed she wasn't sure what her role had been in hurting the child, saying that Richard was usually the one who handled discipline. From the very beginning of their arrest, Richard and Anisha began blaming each other for what had happened to Rebecca. The detectives decided to test Anisha's understanding of how serious the situation was. They asked her a direct question. "What do you think would happen to someone who seriously injured a 10-year-old girl?" Her answer showed how disconnected she was from reality. Anisha said she didn't really know, but thought maybe the person would get some jail time. This response shocked the investigators. They were dealing with charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and child abuse, crimes that could result in life in prison or even the death penalty. But Anisha seemed to think that severely injuring a child would only result in a short stay in jail. Even more troubling was the fact that Anisha, with her medical background, had not called for emergency help right away when she found Rebecca in such terrible condition. As a former nurse, she should have known that immediate medical attention was crucial for someone with such severe injuries. When police asked her why she hadn't called 911 immediately, especially given her medical training, Anisha made excuses that fell apart under scrutiny. First, she claimed that they couldn't get cell phone service at their remote location in the yurt. She insisted that living so far out in the desert made it impossible to call anyone for help. However, the police officers who were interviewing her were able to make phone calls from that exact same location without any problems. When they pointed this out, Anisha's excuse crumbled. Under continued questioning, Anisha finally admitted to something that made the situation even more suspicious. She confessed that yes, she had changed Rebecca's clothing before calling 911. This admission raised serious questions about what had really happened that day. If Rebecca had been found in the wash as they claimed, why would her clothes need to be changed? And why were the clothes that were removed from Rebecca's body bloody? The bloody clothing found in their tent suggested that Rebecca's injuries had occurred at home, not in some distant wash where neighbors supposedly found her. The evidence was pointing toward a very different story than the one Richard and Anisha were telling. The investigation revealed an even more disturbing pattern of failure that went far beyond Richard and Anisha's actions. The system that was supposed to protect Rebecca had failed her repeatedly over many years. This failure involved multiple agencies and many missed opportunities to save her life. Rebecca's school, Empower College Prep in Phoenix, had been desperately trying to get help for her. Between November 2023 and January 2025, the school contacted the Department of Child Safety, DCS, 12 different times to report suspected abuse and neglect. Rebecca's teachers had noticed signs that worried them deeply, and they kept making reports because they saw that things were getting worse, not better. However, DCS disputed the school's claim about the number of reports. The agency said they had only received 5 calls from the school, and that only one of those calls met their legal requirements for starting an investigation. This disagreement about basic facts showed how broken the communication was between the people trying to protect Rebecca and the agency supposed to help her. The problems with DCS went back much further than Rebecca's school reports. The Arizona Department of Child Safety had received at least 12 reports about the Baptiste family over the course of 10 years, starting when Rebecca was only 8 months old in August 2015. These early reports showed that concerns about Rebecca's welfare had been raised almost from the time she was born. The first report came on August 29, 2015, when Rebecca was just 8 months old. Someone was worried about neglect by both of her parents. Richard Baptiste and her mother, Sandy Hawkins. The person making the report was concerned about the condition of their home and suspected that Rebecca's parents might be using drugs. A DCS investigator came to check on baby Rebecca but decided there was no immediate danger. The report was marked as unsubstantiated, meaning they couldn't prove the concerns were valid, but the case stayed open. In May 2016, when Rebecca was about a year and a half old, DCS received another report about her parents neglecting her care. This time, the concerns were about a severe diaper rash that wasn't being treated properly and an ear infection that her parents had ignored. Again, an investigator visited Rebecca at home but decided there was no immediate danger. This report was also marked as unsubstantiated. More reports followed in October 2017, when DCS received concerns about a 10-month-old child being left alone for hours. While the report didn't specifically name Rebecca, investigators assumed it was about her. Once again, the investigator found no evidence of immediate danger, and the allegation was marked as unsubstantiated. The family was offered help through community resources and daycare, but they refused these services. The case was closed on December 29, 2017. The pattern continued for years. People would report concerns about Rebecca and her family. Investigators would look into the situation, but the reports would be dismissed as unsubstantiated. It seemed like no matter how many times people tried to get help for Rebecca, the system couldn't find enough evidence to take action. Finally, in March 2019, something changed. DCS received a report alleging neglect of Rebecca and her siblings that was serious enough for the agency to take action. This report claimed that Sandy Hawkins, Rebecca's mother, had exposed a child to illegal substances during pregnancy. This time, the investigation resulted in Rebecca and her siblings being removed from their home and placed in foster care. For 3 to 4 years, Rebecca and her brothers lived in foster care, away from both of their biological parents. During this time, they were supposed to be safe and learning what normal family life could look like. However, in 2022, their father, Richard Baptiste, fought in court to get his children back. He filed what's called a dependency petition in Maricopa County Superior Court, asking a judge to return his children to his care. The court decided to give Richard another chance to be a father. At the same time, Rebecca's mother, Sandy Hawkins, lost all her parental rights permanently. This meant that Sandy could never again legally be considered Rebecca's mother or have any say in what happened to her daughter. Sandy was completely removed from Rebecca's life, leaving Richard as the only biological parent who could care for the children. Unfortunately, this decision to reunite Rebecca and her brothers with their father would prove to be tragically wrong. Almost immediately after getting his children back, new reports of abuse began reaching DCS. On November 2, 2023, DCS received a report alleging that Richard Baptiste and his girlfriend Anisha Woods were physically abusing Rebecca and her siblings. While the specific details of this report were not made public, the allegations were serious enough to warrant investigation. However, once again, the report was marked as unsubstantiated because investigators said there wasn't enough evidence to prove the abuse was happening. This November 2023 report marked the beginning of what would become a desperate campaign by Rebecca's school to get her help. Empower College Prep, where Rebecca was a student in Phoenix, would contact DCS 12 times between November 2023 and January 2025. The teachers and staff at Rebecca's school could see that something was terribly wrong, and they kept calling for help because they could see that Rebecca's situation was getting worse. The people who worked at Rebecca's school must have felt helpless and heartbroken when they learned that Rebecca had died. They had tried so many times to get someone to listen to their concerns and take action to protect her. Despite their repeated efforts, the system failed to save the little girl they were trying to help. In February 2024, DCS received another report, this time about one of Rebecca's brothers. Someone reported that Anisha Woods had scratched the boy during what she claimed was discipline for not doing his homework. When investigators interviewed the child, he said the scratch was an accident and that he felt safe at home. Based on this statement, the case was closed with no further action. This response from Rebecca's brother showed one of the biggest problems with investigating child abuse. Children who are being hurt often protect their abusers because they're scared, they don't know any better, or they've been taught what to say. When a frightened child tells investigators that everything is fine at home, it doesn't necessarily mean they're safe. But the system often treats these statements as proof that no abuse is occurring. The reports to DCS continued into 2025. On January 16, 2025, the agency received a report alleging that Richard and Anisha were neglecting Rebecca by forcing her to run as punishment without giving her water or letting her take bathroom breaks. This type of punishment could be extremely dangerous, especially in Arizona's hot climate. The allegation was investigated, but once again it was marked as unsubstantiated due to what officials called a lack of evidence. The case was closed on February 28, 2025. In April 2025, Phoenix police officers went to the Baptiste home because Rebecca had missed several days of school. When they saw Rebecca, the officers noticed that she had a black eye. However, Richard was able to give what the police considered a believable explanation for how Rebecca got the injury. The officers didn't take any photographs of Rebecca's black eye, and they didn't find what they considered direct proof of abuse. DCS was notified about the incident, but it was only recorded as an information report, and no further action was taken. This April incident was particularly tragic because it represented another missed opportunity to save Rebecca's life. A black eye on a child who had been the subject of multiple abuse reports should have triggered a much more thorough investigation. The fact that no photos were taken and no follow-up action occurred showed how the system continued to fail Rebecca even when warning signs were clearly visible. On May 19, 2025, DCS received yet another report alleging physical abuse of Rebecca and her siblings by Anisha Woods. This report specifically mentioned spankings as punishment. When DCS workers tried to visit the family's home in Phoenix and check with Empower College Prep, they made a disturbing discovery. The family had moved away without telling anyone where they were going. The Baptiste family had relocated to Concho in Apache County without providing updated contact information to any of the agencies that were supposed to be monitoring their situation. This meant that DCS lost track of the children entirely. The investigation remained technically open, but with no way to find the family, there was nothing more the agency could do. In early July 2025, the Baptiste family settled into their new life in a remote campsite in Concho, Apache County. They were living in a yurt, which is like a large tent without electricity or running water. This isolated location made it even harder for anyone to check on the children's welfare. During the 3 weeks they lived in this remote location, Rebecca attempted to run away multiple times. There were 3 documented attempts in those 3 weeks alone, showing how desperate Rebecca was to escape from her situation. Each time she tried to run away, she was found and brought back, only to face more punishment for trying to leave. On July 27, 2025, the story came full circle. 10-year-old Rebecca Baptiste was found unresponsive in a wash at the intersection of State Route 77 and U.S. Route 180 in Holbrook, Arizona. 3 days later, on July 30, 2025, Rebecca died from her injuries. Rebecca's death put Arizona's Department of Child Safety under intense criticism from the public and the media. People wanted to know how a child who had been the subject of at least 12 reports of abuse and neglect over the course of a decade could slip through the cracks of the system that was supposed to protect her. The problem seemed to be that DCS had set the bar too high for what constituted enough evidence to remove a child from their home. In many of the reports about Rebecca's family, the allegations didn't meet the agency's threshold for action. When children like Rebecca's brother told investigators that they felt safe at home, those statements often led to cases being closed, even though experienced child abuse investigators should have known that scared children often protect their abusers. Critics argued that the standards DCS used were too rigid and left vulnerable children like Rebecca at risk. They pointed out that Rebecca's story was a painful reminder of what happens when systems fail the children they're meant to protect. Rebecca's death wasn't just the result of the actions of her father and his girlfriend. It was the result of years of missed opportunities for intervention. The tragedy of Rebecca's story extends beyond her own suffering to include the trauma experienced by her brothers. They had lived through the same horrible conditions, witnessing their sister's abuse and likely experiencing their own mistreatment. Now they were left without their sister, having seen the worst that humans can do to each other. Many people felt angry and heartbroken when they learned about all the chances that had been missed to save Rebecca's life. There had been so many reports from so many different people, teachers, school officials, neighbors, and others who had seen signs that something was wrong. Each person who made a report was trying to help Rebecca, but the system failed to respond effectively to their concerns. The case raised important questions about how child protection agencies investigate reports of abuse and what standards should be used to determine when a child needs to be removed from their home. Rebecca's death showed that the current system wasn't working well enough to protect children who were in danger. Richard and Anisha were scheduled to appear in court again on September 4, 2025, for their preliminary hearing. Many people expected that they would try to blame each other for what had happened to Rebecca, since they had already begun pointing fingers during their initial interviews with police. Rebecca's brothers were now in the custody of the Arizona Department of Child Safety, hopefully in a place where they would finally be safe and could begin to heal from the trauma they had experienced. Many people worried about these boys and hoped that this time, the system would do a better job of protecting them. Rebecca's story serves as a tragic reminder that child abuse prevention requires not just laws and agencies, but also vigilant communities and systems that are willing to act when children are in danger. Too many people had tried to help Rebecca, but the system designed to protect her had failed at every crucial moment. Her death was preventable, which made it even more heartbreaking for everyone who had tried to save her. What if the person you called for help in your darkest hour was the one planning to kill you? On December 16, 2022, Alex Pennig called someone she trusted when she felt threatened. 3 hours later, she was dead on her bathroom floor with a bullet through her skull. The 911 caller claimed she shot herself. Police almost believed him, but tiny clues at the crime scene told a different, more terrifying story. Someone had murdered Alex and staged it as suicide. Someone who thought they were smart enough to fool investigators. Someone who was dead wrong. But who pulls the trigger on someone begging for help? And how do you get away with murder when the evidence is staring you right in the face? The winter air was bitter cold that December morning in St. Paul, Minnesota. Snow crunched under the boots of police officers as they rushed toward the apartment building on East Street. It was 2:57 a.m. when their radios crackled with an urgent call that would shatter the quiet of the sleeping neighborhood. Inside apartment 265, a scene of unimaginable horror awaited them. The caller's voice had been shaky, desperate, claiming a woman had been shot in the head. As officers climbed the stairs, their hearts pounded with the knowledge that they were about to witness something terrible. The man who let them inside was trembling violently. Matthew Ecker, a 44-year-old nurse practitioner, could barely speak through his tears. His hands shook as he pointed toward the small bathroom where 32-year-old Alex Pennig lay motionless on the cold tile floor. Blood pooled around her blonde hair. Her lifeless body was positioned strangely, with her legs spread on either side of the bathroom door. A single gunshot wound marked her left temple, and beside her shoulder rested a deadly weapon that would become the center of a twisted mystery. The apartment felt heavy with death. Prescription bottles were scattered across surfaces, and empty alcohol containers told the story of a night that had gone horribly wrong. But something didn't feel right to the experienced officers who had seen countless crime scenes before. Matthew collapsed in the hallway, gasping for air between sobs. "She just grabbed the gun," he kept repeating to anyone who would listen. "She locked herself in the bathroom and I heard the shot." His words echoed through the small apartment, but they would soon be questioned by investigators who noticed details that didn't match his heartbreaking story. Emergency medical teams arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do for Alex. Her vibrant life had been cut short in the most violent way imaginable. As they officially pronounced her dead, the Real investigation was just beginning. The responding officers exchanged glances. The scene looked wrong somehow. The position of the body, the placement of the weapon, the dry bathroom sink despite claims of bloody hands being washed, small details that would eventually unravel a web of lies and expose a killer hiding behind tears of fake grief. Within hours, the small apartment transformed into a bustling crime scene. Yellow tape blocked curious neighbors as experienced detectives Abby DeSanto and Jennifer O'Donnell took control of what would become one of the most puzzling cases of their careers. The medical examiner arrived as dawn broke over St. Paul. Dr. Sarah Chun carefully examined Alex's body, noting the precise angle of the gunshot wound and the strange positioning that had already caught the attention of first responders. Every detail mattered in determining whether this was suicide or something far more sinister. Forensic specialists swarmed the tiny bathroom like worker bees. They collected blood samples from multiple surfaces, dusted for fingerprints on every possible surface, and carefully bagged prescription bottles scattered throughout the apartment. The gun itself would undergo extensive testing for DNA evidence and gunshot residue patterns. Something immediately struck investigators as odd. Despite Matthew's claims of washing bloody hands in the bathroom sink, forensic experts found the basin completely dry with minimal blood evidence. The water should have been wet if someone had just cleaned up after touching a bleeding victim. Detective DeSanto began the methodical process of interviewing everyone connected to Alex's final hours. Neighbors reported no unusual sounds from the apartment that night, which seemed strange given the violent nature of her death. The walls in the old building were thin enough that arguments and disturbances typically carried between units. Security cameras from the apartment building would prove crucial in establishing a timeline. Footage showed Alex and Matthew entering together around 2 a.m., appearing relaxed and talking normally. But later footage revealed something troubling that Matthew hadn't mentioned in his tearful confession to officers. The investigation quickly focused on two men who had been central figures in Alex's life. Shane Anderson, her current boyfriend who had been involved in a bar fight hours before her death, became an immediate person of interest. Then there was Matthew himself, whose story contained troubling inconsistencies that experienced investigators couldn't ignore. Phone records would be subpoenaed, financial transactions examined, and every relationship in Alex's life scrutinized for potential motives. The prescription medications found at the scene raised questions about her mental state, but also about who had access to supply them. As evidence mounted, investigators realized they weren't dealing with a simple suicide case. The positioning of Alex's body, the forensic evidence, and the timeline of events suggested something much darker had occurred in that small bathroom during the early morning hours of December 16th. Alex Pennig was the kind of person who rescued stray animals and stayed late to comfort patients during their worst moments. At 32 years old, she had golden blonde hair that changed colors as often as her mood, and a smile that could light up the darkest hospital room. Her dream had always been simple but powerful, to heal people who were hurting, just like the nurses who had once saved her own life. Growing up in Minnesota, Alex was a firecracker on the ice hockey rink. Her childhood friend Jillian still remembers the fierce competitor who helped their team win a state championship. She was pure fire on ice. Jillian would later tell investigators through tears, "You never wanted to play against Alex because she would destroy you, but in the sweetest way possible." But beneath that tough exterior lived someone who fought invisible demons. Her parents, Mary Jo and Jim Pennig, watched helplessly as their bright daughter struggled with depression during college. Pills became her escape from pain she couldn't name. The darkness nearly consumed her completely in 2016 when she swallowed a handful of medication in a desperate cry for help, only to make herself vomit moments later. That rock-bottom moment became her turning point. Alex clawed her way back from the edge and earned her nursing degree in 2019. At graduation, she stood before hundreds of people and spoke words that would haunt her family forever. "I have climbed out of darkness with permanent scars but a heart of gold." Her recovery seemed complete. Alex found work at a walk-in clinic where she met Matthew Ecker, a married nurse practitioner with 4 children. What started as friendship between co-workers quickly became something forbidden and dangerous. Matthew's wedding ring didn't stop the attraction between them, and soon they were meeting in secret while his wife remained clueless at home. The affair burned hot but brief. Alex ended things when guilt became unbearable, but Matthew couldn't let go. Even after she moved on, he continued inserting himself into her life, paying her rent when jobs became scarce and refilling prescription medications despite the ethical violations. Enter Shane Anderson, a sweet guy who made Alex laugh again. Their relationship blossomed quickly in the fall of 2022. Shane wasn't just another boyfriend. He was planning their future together, talking about breaking his lease to move in with her. For the first time in years, Alex seemed genuinely happy. But happiness made some people angry. Matthew watched from the sidelines as Alex built a new life with Shane. The financial support continued, creating a twisted triangle where a married man bankrolled his former lover's relationship with another man. Alex's friends noticed the arrangement made them uncomfortable, but Alex insisted Matthew was just helping out a friend. The truth was far more complicated. Matthew had become obsessed with staying connected to Alex, using money and prescription drugs as his way to remain important in her world. When she needed Adderall or anxiety medication, she would text him instead of seeing a real doctor. When rent was due and her latest job had ended, Matthew's credit card would save the day. Alex's family had no idea about the financial web binding their daughter to a married man. They knew Matthew as just a work friend who sometimes helped out during tough times. The depth of his involvement in Alex's daily life remained hidden until it was far too late. Shane also remained unaware of how extensively Matthew controlled Alex's finances and medical care. He knew about their work friendship but had no clue about the thousands of dollars changing hands or the prescription medications being illegally refilled by someone who wasn't Alex's doctor. This dangerous secret would prove to be the spark that ignited a deadly confrontation. Because when people have too much to lose and too many lies to protect, violence becomes their final solution. December 15, 2022 started like any other Thursday for Alex Pennig. Text messages show she was in good spirits, joking with her mother about holiday plans and discussing moving in with her boyfriend Shane. Her digital trail painted the picture of someone looking forward to the future, not planning to end her life. The final hours began when Alex's phone buzzed with an urgent call around 11 a.m. Matthew Ecker was driving to work in Fergus Falls, 3 hours away, when Alex reached out claiming she needed help escaping a dangerous situation with Shane. Phone records would later show this conversation lasted 18 minutes. Plenty of time to craft a story or manipulate someone into making a deadly decision. What happened during those crucial daylight hours remained murky. Matthew called in sick to work and made the long drive to St. Paul while Alex waited in her apartment. Security cameras at nearby businesses caught glimpses of Matthew's vehicle entering the city around 2 p.m., confirming his timeline up to that point. By early evening, the pair had decided to hit the downtown bar scene. Multiple establishments captured them on surveillance, moving from place to place, drinking heavily and appearing relaxed together. Bartenders later told police that Alex seemed happy but was consuming alcohol at a dangerous rate, mixing drinks with the prescription medications already in her system. The night took a violent turn at Camp Bar around midnight. Security footage captured every second of the brutal confrontation when Shane Anderson spotted his girlfriend with another man. The cameras showed Shane's rage exploding as he realized Alex was on what appeared to be a date with a stranger. Digital evidence revealed Alex had been texting someone during the fight, but investigators hit a brick wall when they couldn't access her phone. The passcode died with her, and Shane's convenient claim that he'd lost his phone the same night raised immediate red flags among detectives. The final footage of Alex alive came from her apartment building's lobby cameras. At 2:08 a.m., she and Matthew entered together, appearing to be getting along normally. But 19 minutes later, they emerged again briefly before returning separately, and Alex's body language told a chilling story of anger and frustration. Matthew's movements during those crucial minutes would become the center of intense scrutiny. He claimed they went to his car to retrieve headphones, but the cameras showed something different. Alex waited in the lobby, furiously typing on her phone while glaring at the entrance. When Matthew finally returned, she refused to hold the door open for him and stormed toward the elevator. The medical examiner would later determine Alex died between 2:45 and 2:55 a.m. Matthew's 911 call came in at exactly 2:53 a.m., giving investigators a tiny window to work with. But that narrow time frame would prove crucial in exposing the lies that followed. When detectives began comparing witness statements, cracks appeared in every story. Shane insisted he went straight home after being kicked out of the bar, but couldn't provide any proof since his phone was mysteriously missing. Matthew claimed Alex grabbed his gun and killed herself, but forensic evidence suggested the bathroom door was forced open before she died. Neighbors reported hearing no gunshot despite the thin walls between apartments. Bar staff remembered Alex seeming upset about something beyond just the fight with Shane. Even her cats, usually friendly and social, were hiding under furniture when police arrived, behavior that suggested they'd witnessed something traumatic. The timeline reconstruction painted a picture of a woman whose final night spiraled from celebration to confrontation to death in less than 3 hours. But the more detectives dug into those final moments, the more they realized someone was lying about what really happened when Alex Pennig drew her last breath. Detectives knew the ugly truth about murder. It usually comes from someone you trust. As they built their suspect list, 3 names rose to the top, each carrying secrets dark enough to kill for. Shane Anderson looked guilty from the moment police knocked on his door. The boyfriend who'd thrown punches just hours before Alex died, who conveniently lost his phone the same night, who had anger issues bad enough to punch holes in closet doors during fights. His reaction to news of Alex's death seemed genuine, but seasoned investigators knew that even killers could produce real tears. The hole-punched closet door in Alex's apartment told its own violent story. Shane admitted to the damage during a drunken rage weeks earlier, proving he had a history of explosive anger when things didn't go his way. His claims of planning a future with Alex rang hollow when detectives learned about his jealous nature and controlling behavior. But Shane's alibi was surprisingly solid. Multiple witnesses confirmed he'd been kicked out of the bar and security cameras showed him leaving alone. Unless he'd somehow snuck back into Alex's building unseen, his window of opportunity was closing fast. Matthew Ecker presented a different kind of danger, the obsessed former lover who refused to let go. Married with 4 children, he'd been financially supporting his ex-mistress for months, while secretly refilling her prescription medications. His 3-hour drive to rescue Alex raised immediate suspicions about his true motives that night. The financial web Matthew had woven around Alex was staggering. $28,000 in rent payments, grocery money, and other expenses, far more than a casual friend would provide. His family claimed he was just being generous, but investigators saw something more sinister. A man using money to maintain control over a woman who tried to move on. Then there was Matthew's bizarre behavior after finding Alex's body. His story kept changing, first claiming he never touched the gun, then admitting he'd moved it to his suitcase before placing it back on her body. What innocent person tampers with evidence at a crime scene? Other potential suspects emerged from Alex's complicated life. Former co-workers who'd witnessed her struggles with addiction, ex-boyfriends from her darker days, even patients who might have developed unhealthy attachments to their beautiful nurse. Each relationship was examined for signs of obsession, rejection, or revenge. But as detectives dug deeper, one suspect's story crumbled faster than the others. The man who claimed to be Alex's protector, who insisted he'd only come to save her from danger, whose tears seemed so genuine in those first moments. He would soon be revealed as something far more terrifying than a grieving friend. The investigation was about to expose a killer hiding behind a facade of love and concern, someone who'd used Alex's trust and vulnerability to get close enough to destroy her when she threatened his carefully constructed lies. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a tiny piece of metal no bigger than a wedding ring. When forensic technicians moved Alex's body, they discovered a fragment from the bathroom door lock lying directly underneath her head. This single piece of evidence would shatter Matthew's entire story. If Alex had truly locked herself in the bathroom and shot herself as Matthew claimed, that metal fragment should have been anywhere except under her body. The only way it could have ended up there was if the door was forced open before she fell to the ground, meaning someone had broken in and shot her while she was still alive. Security footage delivered the second devastating blow to Matthew's credibility. The lobby cameras captured their final moments together, and Alex's body language screamed of anger and betrayal. She stormed through the building, refusing to hold doors, while Matthew followed behind with guilty shoulders hunched in defeat. This was no happy couple returning from a fun night out. The forensic analysis of the gun revealed more shocking truths. Despite Matthew's claims that Alex grabbed his weapon and pulled the trigger, her DNA was found on the grip, but his fingerprints were completely absent. For a gun owner who admitted handling his weapon that night, the complete lack of his genetic material suggested one terrifying possibility: he'd wiped it clean. Gunshot residue patterns told their own story of deception. Alex's left hand showed particles consistent with firing a weapon, but experts noted something crucial. She was right-handed. The awkward positioning required to shoot herself with her non-dominant hand while allegedly backing into a bathroom defied logic and physics. The dry bathroom sink became a symbol of Matthew's crumbling lies. He insisted he'd washed bloody hands immediately before calling 911, but forensics found no moisture, no blood traces in the drain, and no water stains on the faucet. Either he was lying about helping Alex, or he'd waited much longer than claimed before reporting her death. Phone records revealed Matthew's obsessive behavior in the weeks before Alex's death. Desperate text messages begging her to let him refill medications, emotional pleas about needing to see her, and increasingly frantic attempts to maintain contact with someone who was clearly trying to distance herself from his suffocating presence. The final piece clicked when investigators realized Matthew had prescribed every single medication found in Alex's apartment. This wasn't just unethical, it was evidence of control. He'd been managing her mental state through drugs, keeping her dependent while positioning himself as her savior from problems he may have helped create. When confronted with this mountain of evidence, Matthew's mask finally slipped. His story changed again, this time admitting he'd moved the gun and tampered with the crime scene. But his explanation made no sense to anyone except a desperate man caught in lies too big to maintain. The net was closing, and Matthew Ecker was running out of stories to tell. The arrest shattered Matthew Ecker's world in minutes. Police arrived at his family home on a quiet morning, cuffing him in front of his 4 children as neighbors watched in shock. The respected nurse practitioner who'd built a reputation saving lives was now accused of taking one in the most brutal way possible. Matthew's reaction was ice-cold calculation mixed with desperate denial. "This is a mistake," he kept repeating as cameras flashed outside the courthouse. "I loved Alex. I would never hurt her." But his composed demeanor cracked when detectives showed him the metal door fragment that destroyed his suicide story. In the interrogation room, psychological warfare began immediately. Detective DeSanto spoke softly, almost motherly, while Detective Zebro played the aggressive bad cop. They tag-teamed Matthew for hours, presenting evidence that made his lies impossible to maintain. "The blood was dried when we got there, Matthew," DeSanto explained calmly. "That takes time. Much more time than you claim passed before calling 911. Matthew's hands shook as he realized how thoroughly the evidence contradicted his timeline. When confronted with the security footage showing Alex's anger in the lobby, Matthew finally cracked partially. He admitted moving the gun, claiming panic drove his actions. But he maintained Alex shot herself, even as detectives proved the bathroom door was forced open before her death. The trial began in February 2024 with media circus surrounding the courthouse. Prosecutor Sarah Williams painted Matthew as a controlling predator who'd murdered Alex when she threatened to expose their affair to his wife. After 9 agonizing hours of deliberation, the jury reached their verdict. The courtroom was dead silent as the foreman stood. Guilty of murder in the 2nd degree. Matthew's face went white as his family collapsed in the gallery behind him. At sentencing, Alex's parents delivered heart-wrenching victim impact statements. "Our daughter was stolen from us by someone she trusted," Mary Jo Penig said through tears. "He took our baby and destroyed our family forever." Judge Patricia Williams showed no mercy. "You betrayed Alex's trust in the most violent way possible. 30 years in prison is the price for that betrayal." The gavel's bang echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, sealing Matthew's fate. Matthew's family still believes he's innocent, promising to fight his conviction forever. But for Alex's loved ones, justice had finally been served for the nurse whose only crime was trusting the wrong man with her life.